Good morning, everyone. I feel tremendously privileged to be moderating this panel of esteemed speakers who will be speaking about artist estates and archives, both of which I think are extremely crucial aspects while thinking about museum practices. We've been speaking about, museums borrowing, loaning works, questions of permissions, protocols of access when one deals with, borrowing collections and so on. And artist estates are often one of the things that one confronts in this process of exhibition making. A large part of the work that I do with colleagues at the Asiad Archive is to sort of engage very closely with artists, critics, curators. And the work that we do primarily involves sort of documenting and digitizing and making accessible online their personal materials from their personal archives. It's been extremely sort of inspiring to work in close proximity with such individuals, where one not only sort of engages with the works that they produce in a sense, but also their lives and practices. In all of this, one of the conversations that sort of never fails to pop up is the remarkable absence of entities such as archives and institutions in South Asia particularly, to which artists may bequeath their collections and their archival documents that they've collected over the course of time. The dearth of sort of institutions which can hold these materials safely and more importantly, allow them to be accessed responsibly. There is genuine concern, I think, across the board of what one is to do with a lifetime of work in the absence of institutional support to host them. In that sense, artist estates and archives, at least as legal registered entities in South Asia and perhaps for much of Asia, are not the norm, but actually perhaps an exception. Perhaps we might say that this sort of condition has created fertile ground to get creative with how one manages estates and archives, but nonetheless, I think that this is sort of a growing sort of concern for many artists and sort of creative practitioners as to what one is to do with all of this material that they've put together. And this is perhaps quite different from Euro-American context, where we know of several artist estates and foundations that have been set up as very formal legal entities. We also know of universities, colleges, and private institutions that actually hold archival materials, artworks, and so on in their collections. Now, we know that it takes remarkable dedication and commitment to ensure that collections and archival materials don't just remain as frozen, static repositories, but, and such that it is not only the artist's legacy that, these institutions these estates and so on ensure that not only does the artist's legacy continue to sort of remain relevant for contemporary research and discourse, but that they also become, in a sense, a starting point to facilitate and encourage new forms of practices, new questions to emerge. In other words, to think of estates and archives as not just repositories, but also as being generative, that they can facilitate new forms of practices and questions. For today's panel, which, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 esteemed speakers, each of whom, among many other significant work they have undertaken, also manage the archives, collections, or foundations of 3 very exceptional figures: John Cage, Yayoi Kusama, and Syed Haider Raza. Each of these practitioners, as we know, have carved out very distinct positions vis-a-vis the modernist idioms of their times. Their works span very different geopolitical and historical locations, creative fields, media, and genres. And all of them have worked at varying levels of intensities. Today's panel, I think, then provides us an excellent opportunity to learn from individuals who have been dealing with the legacies of these figures, not as an end in itself, but as a starting point to ruminate on the context and conditions of our contemporary times. I begin by introducing our speakers in the order in which they will be making their presentations. Laura Kuhn is Executive Director of the John Cage Trust in Red Hook, New York. Upon John Cage's death in 1992, Laura Kuhn joined with longtime associates Merce Cunningham and Diarnon Court and David Vaughan to found the John Cage Trust. As its executive director, Kuhn lectures and conducts performance workshops around the world. Projects under her direction include a CD-ROM of sampled piano preparations from Cage's landmark sonatas and interludes, a stage adaptation of Cage's whimsical 1982 radio play James Joyce, Marshall Duchamp, Eric Satie, and Alphabet. And for Cage's centennial in 2012, an exhibition titled Cage's Satie, Composition for Museum, an exhibition which was held in Lyon. In 2007, the John Cage Trust joined the ranks of the Bard College in New York's Hudson Valley, where Kuhn became the first John Cage Professor of Performance Arts. In celebration, she directed a stage version of Cage's still politically prescient theater piece, Lecture on the Weather, from 1976, and among her recent publications are The Selected Letters of John Cage, published in 2016, and Love Icebox Letters from John Cage to Merce Cunningham, published in 2019. Our second speaker is Akira Tatehata, director of the Yayoi Kusama Museum in Tokyo and president of the Tama Art University in Tokyo. Akira Tatehata is a leading art critic, poet, and museologist in Japan. He is the director of the Yayoi Kusama Museum in Tokyo and chairman of the Japanese Museum Association. Known for his specialization in modern and contemporary art criticism, he was the artistic director of the Aichi Triennial in 2010 and the first Yokohama Triennial in 2001, the director of the National Museum of Art, Osaka, from 2005 to 2011, and the president of the Kyoto City University of Arts from 2011 to 2015, as well as the Japanese commissioner for the Venice Biennale in 1993 and 1990, where he supported the then controversial Yayoi Kusama representation of Japan at the 45th Venice Biennial in 1993. He became the 10th president of Tama Art University in Tokyo in 2015. His art criticism has been widely published, and as a poet, he is the recipient of the Takami Jun Prize in 2005, among other accolades. He received his BA in French literature from the Waseda University in Tokyo in 1972. And our last speaker is Ashok Vajpeyi, who is managing and life trustee of the Raza Foundation in New Delhi. Ashok Vajpeyi is a Hindi poet and critic and has been an instrumental figure in the arts in India. He has founded many cultural institutions, most notably the multi-arts complex Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, Mahatma Gandhi International Hindi University in Wardha, and the Raza Foundation. With more than 30 books of poetry and criticism published in Hindi, he has also written in English on Hindustani classical music and visual arts. His poetry has been published in various languages, including Bengali, English, French, German, Gujarati, and many others. From 2008 to 2011, he served as the chairman of the National Academy of the Arts. He is the recipient of the prestigious Kabir Samman in 2006 and the Sahitya Academy Award in 1994 for his contribution to Indian literature. His many international accolades include the Order of the Arts and Letters from the French government in 2005 and the Officer's Cross of Merit of the Republic of Poland in 2004. A very warm welcome to all our speakers, and request Professor Kuhn to make her presentation. Thank you.
Hi. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of such an extraordinary couple of days. As really everyone has said in the presentation remarks just before I came on, this has been an exercise for me to listen and be constantly reminded of what I do as being different from what other people do. That's in part of because who I represent, but it's also part of the uniqueness of the organization itself, of the John Cage Trust, which is even unusual in America, if not throughout the world. That isn't to say that there aren't institutions that represent solo artists, but they tend to be either far larger or far smaller. So we have a kind of toehold in the world. We represent John Cage, I believe, very well and very fairly in the world, but it is probably our size and our reach is not commensurate with the importance of our composer. That's my opinion. So in thinking about how to present, the only thing that I brought up here was my phone, so I can time myself, so we can try to stay on our schedule here today. Really just thinking about going back to what the invitation was, which did in fact prompt a conversation between me and Kelly about, really, Kelly? Really? This would work? But really going back to this question of collections. Like, what are collections? What does that mean? And obviously, for a museum, collections are a very different thing than collections for an artist representation organization of some sort. So I'm going to give you just a very thumbnail sketch of how the John Cage Trust came into being. And you can see how the collection strategy, if you will, didn't exist, and how it's changed over the past 26 years of our existence. So John Cage died in 1992, having left no instruction about the future of his work other than that everything should pass to his lifelong partner, Merce Cunningham. Merce Cunningham was horrified. Merce Cunningham himself was entering his 40th year of existence with the Merce Cunningham Dance Foundation and Company, and was beyond busy. He was also grieving at the loss of his partner of some 40 years at that time. So much so that how we moved forward fell on really two people, and that fell on me as Cage's really only assistant for the previous 5 or 6 years, and the executor of Cage's estate, whose name is Bennett Grutman. And Bennett Grutman is still very much a part of the life of the John Cage Trust to this day. So Bennett and I at the time was living in Arizona, teaching full-time. Bennett Grutman had a full-time practice as a finance accountant, and we were constantly being called on by people in the world to help them with projects that involved the work of John Cage. Now, prior to Cage's death, Cage was the most important support system to anyone who wanted to engage with his work. There wasn't a day that went by that there wasn't somebody visiting the loft, somebody scheduled for lunch, somebody pouring through archival materials, not arranged as an archive yet, but through Cage's just hanging on to everything. And by the way, my experience is that the more a person has a very clear sense of who they are from a very young age, the more they tend to hang on to their lives. So we have ended up having in Cage's home all manner of things. Chessboards from childhood, Christmas ornaments, photographs, thousands of photographs. Whenever I was bored at work, if I didn't have enough to do, I would sit there and make John tell me who was in the photographs. So start the process of really identifying things. But going back to Cage's death, leaving everything to Merce, Merce going, ugh, and going on tour, leaving everything to me and poor Bennett. Not even a year went by. I got off the plane going back to New York for the 50th time, sat down with Merce and said, I can't do this anymore. And he said, what? I said, I just can't do this anymore. I have no life. I have no friends. I have no home. And he said, well, what do you need? And I hadn't thought in those terms. And so I said, I don't know, but I need a bed, and I need a telephone, and I need a fax machine, and I need a travel budget, and I need blah, 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 blah. And within a month, we had that. The John Cage Trust was established almost overnight as a legal entity, as a 501c3, an independent 501c3 with an IRS standing in America, which is called a Type 2 supporting organization. And that's very important for those of you that don't know what that is. It's essentially a status whereby you exist legally, but you exist in a relationship to another organization to assist them. If not for you, then they would have to do it themselves. That's the if not for you test that we passed. And in our formation as the John Cage Trust, we entered into that relationship with the Merce Cunningham Dance Foundation, which, by the way, John Cage himself had served as music director for virtually his entire life. So we became the advisor, the assistants, whatever, having to do with the whole musical aspect of the Merce Cunningham Dance Foundation, which was a very big deal. When we were established, let's go back to now Cage dying, giving everything to Merce, Merce almost having a heart attack, doing it because I can't go on. We were really formed, if you think about it, as a mechanism that would kind of serve the sanity of those of us who were left behind. So it put a structure around those of us who were left behind, who were being asked to sort of help Cage continue his work in the world. It's not possible to fill those shoes, of course, to be that person, but we didn't want what often happens to people's estates when they die is that their holdings, all of their materials go into some sort of ether land for a period of time while scholars all pore over them in private, and then they go, ta-da, and bring them out. We wanted to, Cage's relevance was such in 1992 that we wanted him to stay present in the culture, that we believed in him as an individual who worked across media. So when we were established as the John Cage Trust, we immediately got pulled together all of the materials that John Cage himself had amassed. This turned out to be an enormous amount of material. Just the music manuscript collection alone, for example, numbered just shy of 28,000 pieces of paper. So those are all the compositions that he had composed across his long life, 79 years in total. But also we pulled together materials to form a permanent art collection. There were manuscripts relating to his 9 published works. There were thousands, as I said, of photographs. There was his own personal library, itself comprised of about 1,200 volumes. So all of these materials formed the basis of the archives of the John Cage Trust. The John Cage Trust went into existence in a 2-pronged, interrelated form. It was the business entity, it was the legal heir to John Cage. That is to say, it was given copyright to all of the works, to maintain, to uphold, to support, but it was also became a kind of situational archive, a kind of happenstance archive, whatever we had. And by the way, I want to say, I have a minute and a half, I want to say that when we started the John Cage Trust with our small board of directors, the idea was that the John Cage Trust would last maybe 4 years, maybe 5, and that we would quietly need or not need to be there anymore and we could disappear. What happened, however, was a very remarkable thing in that people responded by growing our archives. So all of a sudden, the world responded by saying, do you want this? Do you want that? We're not talking about the exchange of money. We're not talking about selling things. We're not talking about buying things. It was really just people who had materials that they didn't know what to do with them. The Cage had meant something to either themselves or their parents or their uncle or their families or their high school friends or whatever. And so we started to become this repository for the world. So our archives have grown over the years. I'm not going to say a whole lot more other than to say that the John Cage Trust, in its now 26 years of existence, has itself grown in its behaviors. In the beginning, it was very much only a responsive, or I say only, meaning just that one function, a responsive organization to the world around it. We really just behaved in a manner that people needed us to behave. They needed access, we gave them access. They needed us to take something, we took it. we now produce more. We write books. We do productions. Next week, when I go home, we have a weekend symposium all around cage and mycology and mushrooms. We do 2 or 3 things a year. Cage was, may I remind you, or tell those of you that don't know, John Cage was not only just a composer, but he was a writer. He was a visual artist. He was a chess master, having learned from Marcel Duchamp. He was an amateur mycologist who co-started the New York Mycological Society. He was a great macrobiotic chef. He was not a practicing Zen Buddhist, but a lot of his inspiration in the world came from Eastern religions, Kumaraswamy in particular, and Zen Taitaro Suzuki with regard to Zen. He was a beloved character in the world. He was a beloved man, and part of the sustainability of the John Cage Trust comes through his place in the world. And I like this picture very much, don't you? Anyway, thank you so much.
It's nice for me to have a chance to participate in this panel talking about museum and artist archives. Today, I want to speak about Kusama Museum and her archives. I remember more than maybe 20 years ago, I organized Indian Contemporary Art Show supported by Raza Foundation. At that time, I asked advisor and catalog writer, Professor Gita Kapoor, and most respectable scholar and art critic, and thanks a lot at that time. And the title is Private Mythology. I think it's a quite succeeded exhibition. Many artists mentioned in the videos of the former panelists. Anyway, Yayoi Kusama Museum was founded by her foundation 2 years ago. And I was appointed director and also vice president of the foundation because I'm very close to her these 40 years. And she's now, she was born in 1929, and now this year she's 90 years old. But she's also quite active now and still continue to paint every day. This half century she is living in a mental hospital, and so hospital arranged a big room for her to paint inside the room. Yeah. Kusama's retrospective exhibition had been held by many major museums all over the world. But this museum's activity, based on her own will, her own philosophy, contributed to have Kusama's vehement battle penetrating her life and to deeper understanding her philosophy to save the world and herself by the power of huge love. She is always suffering from the mental illness. It's so many obsessions and so many hallucinations. But as Levinas wrote for her, her own obsession can be a basement of mutual communication. It's very paradoxical. And her obsession, she believes mutual communication and to save the world and herself too. And it's a very, very simple and very wonderful philosophy. I admire this sort of way of thinking. And the activities of the museum are supported by her own archives, located at Kusama Studio near the museum. The most remarkable characteristic of Kusama archive is divergence of documents caused by her extraordinary wide range activities. As you know, she's a painter, she's a sculptor, she's a printmaker, she's a performing performance artist, filmmaker, media artist, and also she's a novelist and poet. And almost no one knows she's very enthusiastic of singing by herself. Yeah. And so the enormous amount of photographs, exhibition catalogs, articles of newspapers and magazines, novels, collected poems, films and video works, documents of performance, record of her song, book about her, TV program, letters, handwriting, memos, and so on, gathered in her archives. And the diversity of languages and place are also exceptional as one artist. These documents classified roughly, but it's not easy to find a simple way of grouping them. So I must started a new system of archivings using the data technology, as I explained below. Anyway, one of the most important goals of Kusama archive is to edit the perfect catalog raisonné of this artist, but maybe it takes several years from now. Now I will speak about how to dataize the Kusama archives. The divergence of Kusama archive makes the works of classification difficult. But from another point of view, this complexity is the charming point of her archives. So we abandoned to adopt the fixed classification systems and replace it by the flexible computer tagging system. For example, the tags of genre, like painting, collage, print, sculpture, media, and so on, and film novel, and the tags of district, place, and cities, like Tokyo, Matsumoto, Seattle, New York, Venice, Milan, Berlin, etc. And tags related movement like minimalism, pop art, group zero, neo-pop, obsessional art, and so on. And tags of years, tags of medium and size. These tags are not under the hierarchical order, located parallel. They located at we write in the same level, and so we can add or omit them, and regrouping or reclassifying them freely according to our own purpose. The unfixed tagging system will contribute the research of her activities and new project of exhibitions greatly. It's also useful for judging of fake and not her works. And I'm now just start to thinking about consideration to introduce blockchain platform system. Blockchain is not only useful in money market, but also it opens a new possibility of our art archives, especially Ethereum system. Do you know the words of the smart contract? In smart contract, in case of the listing data listing system, we cannot write long sentence or long histories. But in smart contract system, we can write in easily more complicated information. For example, condition of copyright, records of restriction, history of the exhibition of each works, and history of the owners, history of the price at the art market, etc. And but the argument just started, and so I'm not sure now it's good or bad. Sometimes it's very dangerous to use block market system because one sort of panopticon, the newly founded panopticon, there are some sort of possibility. I'm not sure. So, but we must answer it's to introduce or not near future. I'm also I'm the director of the Kusama Yayoi Museum and also the president of the Art University. So I started the archive of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies and Designs to combine the university and the museums. Formerly, we used to the word MLA Corporation, Museum Library Archive Corporation, to develop the mutual relationship between these cultural institutions. But recently, we cannot separate these three institutions precisely. The works of curators, librarians, and archives, and sometimes artists looks like somewhat similar. In Triennale or Biennale, not a small number of the artists show themselves the archives as an installation. The tendency of archives-like exhibition is increasing. In an exaggerated way of speaking, nowadays the curators will be archivists and somewhat artists. Last year, I organized the exhibition titled "Impossible Architecture." It consists for unrealized architecture project from Russian avant-garde Vladimir Taturin's Tower, 1919, to the Zaha Hadid's Tokyo Olympic Stadium, rejected by the Japanese government, unfortunately. And also they include Hans Hollein's drawing, Super Studio, and the Archigram's unbuilt project, and so on. In the exhibition of ordinary architecture, they show the photos, plans, models, and CG. These materials are archives of real architecture. But in case of impossible architecture, the real works don't exist. They can exist only in the archive. In other words, we can realize inexistent architecture in our imagination, guided by the archives. For me, it was experimental challenge to combine the archive method and curator method directly. And this means the archive is not only the accumulation of documents and memories, but also the deeply related to the imagination towards the absence, something abandoned or resignation. Paradoxical way of speaking again, the most sexy value of archives is absence of real object or absence of original works. So normally they say it's a minus point of the archives, but I think it's a change it and a more positive way of thinking for archives. Thank you very much.
To 5 of people. So we gave 39 awards from all over the country and helped sometimes some young artists for publish a catalog or something like that. And there were only 3 trustees, and they were all, in a manner of speaking, life trustees. It was only when Raza came back that we decided to expand it. And the expansion, in short, has meant this, that we have in the last 6 years organized around 500 events, which includes panel discussions, memorial lectures, concerts, dance recitals, etc., in 19 cities of India. Although basically we are located in Delhi. When Raza came back, when he bought this building in 2009 and insisted that it should be registered in the name of the foundation. So when he came back, he occupied 2 rooms in the same building. And then after 4 or 5 days, he told me, Ashok, I am a trustee. How can I make use of trust property? I said, but you bought this property. He said, no, that's not the point. You fix a rent. So for 5.5 years, Raza was paying a rent for living in that building, in a building which he had bought out of his own money. Anyway, when he decided to come back, I insisted that you bring all your papers with you. So they were huge. And to tell you something, what we have now, there are 20,000 plus letters. There are 1,200 persons and institutions involved in writing these letters. There are 6,000 plus books and catalogs. And these include books of poetry, and that's how we became friends anyway, and such like. There are 500 photographs of Raza, 200 photographs of Raza working in studios, 2,500 photographs of some other thing, 3,500 miscellaneous photographs. Most of these photographs, we are not able to identify the persons. So we are in a struggle how to identify who is this, who is that. Some I knew, some others knew, but a vast majority of them are unknown. And there are 32 artworks that Raza left, his later period, what he worked here, and 69 works of other younger artists which he used to buy. Raza used to buy younger artist work by way of promoting them. So we have a huge collection of those works also. Now what we have done by way of, so this is an archive which is really part of a foundation. And the job of the foundation is really much wider. It does not confine to visual arts alone. For instance, during his lifetime, he would not allow us to do anything from the foundation and to spend a single pie on anything that we published. So we published his correspondence with Krishan Khanna, we published his correspondence with the other progressive artists, etc. But all these were funded by his gallery. They were published by Raza Foundation, but we did not pay for it. And I mean, things like this. This is a book of his own writings in English, in French, and in Hindi. We published journals. This is a journal edited by Nancy Adajania. Now, in all this, he left everything to us after he died with a will. He also gave the copyright to us. And thereby lies a bit of a dispute. We have a legal dispute with an adopted daughter in France, and we are involved in a legal battle at the moment. This is a vast body of work. 75% or more has been digitalized. And it is publicly not yet accessible. We have all kinds of things, his birth certificate, his school register copy, and things of that kind, and all kinds of other material. We have published a lot of this material, archival material, but we're also planning to do a show of the archives itself. Because there's a lot of material, there are correspondence, letters from some of the most important figures in modern Indian art. And we're planning that maybe, we have been showing a bit of here. Once we showed in Kiran Nadar Museum, some of the letters. We showed also, we're also planning to do many things, which includes a setting up of a Raza Museum. But that Raza Museum will be a very different kind of a museum, which will not have works so many of Raza, because it's very difficult to acquire them now. They are so highly priced. But to create a museum of a different kind of his vision, which was not confined to himself. The other things that we have, it's only after he died that we started calling some events Raza events. For instance, every year we invite an artist to curate an exhibition of young artists, and we invite an art critic to curate an exhibition of young artists. We have, I mean, as I said, we run several series. One here, which is 8 annual memorial lectures. The last lecture was Gayatri Memorial Lecture, which Geeta Kapoor, who's sitting here, gave. And we have, in memory of many, many important, Habib Tanveer, Kumar Gandhar, Mani Kaul, Agge, Daya Krishna, Kelucharan Mahapatra, etc. We organized 2 running series in collaboration with the India International Center. One is called Art Matters, which has been running for nearly 7 years now. And it covers a very, very vast area of art. I mean, we are trying to create at least a oral, maybe, mass of thinking about arts in our time. Things which institutions other than private should be doing. And we are also very clear that a foundation like this has to provide a space for dissent and dissidents. In India today, we are facing a very deep crisis where just because some writers and intellectuals and filmmakers wrote a letter to the Prime Minister condemning the lynching in the name of God, there was a case registered against them for sedition. So in such times, I think these foundations and private institutions have to provide the space for dissent and intelligently, cleverly, because, you know, I've been a civil servant, so I can tell you, the governments are very, very foolish. I mean, they are the stupidest organization man has evolved. But anyway, that apart, so you have to play the cards very well. Some of us have been doing it. Some of us are facing, I am myself under inquiry at the moment, but that's all right. The notion in this country, barring a few exceptions, and there are very, very few, the public institutions have collapsed. The collapse of the public institution is a very major crisis, because in a democracy, it is the responsibility of the public institution to provide whatever. We have started things for schools and colleges. For instance, in Delhi College of Art, we have started a series called Nazdeek, which is only taking an artist to spend an hour or 2 with the students there talking. And the first one was Atul Dodia, who was scheduled to speak for 1 hour, and there were supposed to be only 60 students. 200 students turned up, and he spoke for 2 hours. And so this is a running series. We are taking the classical musicians and classical dancers, etc., to schools in far-off area, in Mandla, in Chhattisgarh, in Raipur, etc. So we are doing a very large number of work. We published journals, 3 journals, one devoted to literature and civilization in Hindi, the other devoted to classical music and classical dance in Hindi again, and a journal devoted to arts and ideas, if one may call them, which is what I showed you just now. So we have a very large format, but the archive is an important part, and we hope we have helped Krishan Khanna to put together his papers. We engaged a person and he seemed to have done it. I am hoping that those papers will also come to us. I don't know. It is for him to decide. We have made the request. But we are also doing celebrations. Raza turns 100 in 2021-22. So we are thinking of doing a series of... Raza was very fond of his friends. And therefore, we are doing a series of events commemorating his friends. So Ram Kumar, Hussain, Souza. In fact, we have already started in Goa a Raza Souza dialogue, which runs in the Museum of Goa every second or third month. We have Raza Fellowships, which at the moment people are working on biographies of Indian writers and Indian artists, which include K.G. Subramaniam. We have already got Bhupen Kafka. We have K.C.S. Panikka. We have Swaminathan. Their biography. There is no tradition of biography in Hindi and other Indian languages, so we are supporting that. So we are doing many things. So whenever you have time and whenever you have the inclination, call us. We will be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your wonderful presentations. I think it's so inspiring whenever we come across, this kind of work which takes years and years, and it still feels like one is barely sort of scratching the surface of the individuals whose archives and estates that one is sort of managing and so on. I thought I'd begin this discussion with a very sort of straightforward question to all of you, which is, how important do you think it is for estates to be formalized or to be instituted as formal entities? Because this is something that a lot of, is it possible for everybody to sort of, to do this on their own? There is a lot of discussion among many artists that, if one has to set it up as a foundation, then it of course takes resources. But, what are your thoughts on on individuals setting up estates as registered legal entities?
I would just simply answer that from a really practical point of view, that at least in America, and I would assume elsewhere, that to get legal standing as a nonprofit organization, meaning that you're not going to be paying taxes on anything that you buy or sell, is a big help. I'm not quite sure that any nonprofits, if you don't register in a legal sense, you are just a business. You still have to register in some sense.
I think it is important that archives should be, in India the situation is rather chaotic. We don't have enough archives. We have artist families who, instead of trying to make the material or trying to take care of the material left by the artist, apart from the artworks, there are whole lot of other things, letters, catalogs, this, that, and the other, which have to be preserved because they have to be, they are crucial for a proper appreciation of a lifetime's work. Now, because this awareness is not there, because unlike United States where you have universities who have repositories, writers give their works, and in fact they are bought by the universities at quite a heavy price in America, but this does not happen here. when I was in a university, I tried to create a kind of archive and of writers, and a writer whose archive material we got, and the daughter was living in America. She recently came and told me that that material is not available. It has disappeared. So there are all kinds of risks. But if you register a foundation as a non-profit charitable institution, as a trust, you have tax exemption. Although the income tax authorities keep on trying to find out some way to tax you. Sure. But that's a battle, which is an epic battle going on in the world for several centuries. So the taxman will come. But it is possible to create a legal framework. Sometimes I think maybe 3, 4, 5 artists can come together, at least posthumously, if not in life, and create sort of foundations. I sometimes think, quite frankly, that if in India 10 artists had set up such foundations, it would have made a huge lot of difference.
Archive is like a museum, it's a non-profit organization. But I think by my own thinking is much more non-profitable. And so it means sometimes artworks can be consumed, but archive cannot be consumed. And it looks like a catalyst. To touch the catalyst, on the surface catalyst, there are so many action, reaction, connection, and so on. So it's open to the public, and there's so many creative reactions happened. But catalyst, it means archive documents cannot be consumed, and so it's much more fit for the non-profit project, I think.
Thank you. Another sort of straightforward question to all of you is, how do you decide the limits of what to collect and what to what doesn't fall within the parameters of your archives and so on?
I think it's a pretty obvious answer for us that when you represent a single artist, everything is relevant to that artist. Anything that that person relied on, anything that that person used, anything that person produced, all is useful to an archive. It's also, I think, one of the things is that with John Cage, the critical period for him in his personal history was a critical time for America as well. So you're looking at a window of like 1946 to 1955, where really the world changed with regard to art production, art consumption, music, visual arts, all of the art forms actually, formation of really a dance, modern dance in America, art scene shift from Paris to New York. That happened earlier, but it was solidified with the abstract expressionists. So our mandate is slightly bit even larger. We're interested in things having to do with his colleagues, his compatriots, Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg, Morton Feldman, all these names who were people who were in his world at the same time. So, but primarily, we don't limit anything that's relevant to John Cage. It's just sort of what we do.
I mean, and since you took possession of since the trust was formed, is there anything that has ever been deaccessioned in a sense?
Never, never. And we also never say no when someone wants to give us something. So we just grow. Okay. We probably grow by 3 to 5 objects a week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
We went from a 2-room archive, if you will, to a 4-story archive in the last decade. Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, because you are a single artist archive, there are certain limitations. But an artist also exists in his time. So there are other artists, other sort of, as she said, other people who were part of the scene in which that artist. In our case, the difficulty is that Raza was very much a part of the Indian scene, but he was also living in France, and for 60 years. So to get that kind of a material, we have not yet attempted. Simply because we had just set up the archive in a certain sense. He died in 2016, and it's only 3 years, 4 years that we are trying to put it together. So if the archive has to become a larger thing, then it would be Raza and his times. And his times will include even theater people and other people and all that. But primarily, it will remain focused on Raza. Yeah.
I'm sorry, my English hearing ability is quite bad, so I cannot understand well. Please.
Sure.
Mami-san, help me.
The question was, how do you decide what to collect and what to discard?
It's a very simple way of speaking. I use sometimes archive is a generative engine or archive for creation. And so normally the archive is to assist studies or curation and so on. But I think archive is a very creative power. And most typical example, we are now collecting the information on the media softwares, algorithms. And to use that algorithm, we can recreate or even we can make a new works of dead artists. For example, we're now trying to Seiko Mikami is a very, very famous media artist, the excellent artist. But the family donated us every document. And so we are now, under the permission of her family, we want to make a new version of the dead artist works. It's a very dangerous sometimes, it's quite ambivalent. But even so, the archive has a very creative possibility in future.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. I mean, archives are unbelievably exciting because they are generative of so much work. In the case of Cage, it's particularly so because we have so many works in Cage's catalog that involve technology. Technology in the 1960s looks very different than technology in the late teens of the 21st century. And we're very interested in what, I like to put it this way, I like to say we're very interested in what John Cage is doing now through people who come to the archives and engage with our materials, his works. I can't tell you how many young people will call or come to see me and say, can I do this like this? You know, and all they have to have is a really good reason why they would do that. And they always do. You know, it's because technology has shifted or they have a different set of thoughts about what they're doing, which makes perfect sense. Here we are, you know, 25, 30 years after the formation of the archives. So I just think archives are wonderful. They are the height of special collections in the world. You know, they're unique.
I'm sort of in continuation with that. I mean, when you say that there are people who want to come in and sort of, you know, work with the material that you have in these archives and so on. To what extent do these institutions that all of you represent, to what extent do you sort of, what is the level of control that you exert over the narratives about these individuals?
We don't exert control over the narratives. You're talking about the narratives that might come out of engagement with our archives. Yeah. We really don't. Okay. We do our hardest. We try our hardest to educate people in their use of our materials, so that they understand what they're looking at and how to interpret it. And there's always going to be somebody who's going to take it in a direction that maybe you don't agree with. But it's still not a wrong direction, you know? It's just not a percentage-wise a really popular one or something like that.
So in terms of protocols of access, for instance, you would be open with anybody wanting to come in and pull anything out of, because one of the things that I think a lot of people worry about, particularly in archives that hold, let's say, correspondences and you know, sort of sensitive, let's say, material, is how is this going to be sort of interpreted? How is this going to be used?
Okay, well, keep in mind, though, so there's two answers to this question. One is that with John Cage, we have 4 central archives for John Cage, all in America. One in New York City for music manuscript, one at Wesleyan University for text manuscripts that augments ours. John Cage Trust, which has original library of John Cage, art collection of about 100 works now. But we also have Wesleyan University outside of Chicago, which has the complete correspondence collection. But, so in answer to your question, all of these organizations are controlled by copyright law, meaning that nothing can leave the premises without permission. So that said, we never deny permission, but it makes people behave better when they have to say, can I take a picture of this? And you say, sure, what are you going to use it for? In that exchange, that one-to-one exchange, we never see an improper use of anything, never. In 26 years, it hasn't happened, so.
Wonderful, yeah. Ashok ji, any?
Well, we had very few who have come to us so far, and we have allowed them all access. We have Yashodhara Dalmia, who's doing a biography of Raza, and she wanted to read through various kinds of materials, including the divorce from his first wife who had shifted to Pakistan, etc. We have allowed that all to happen. I think it would all depend on how authentic the person is who approaches you. There are young scholars who come sometimes from JNU and elsewhere who are doing some work on something and they want to see that. We allow that. Keep an eye, a kind of a careful, watchful eye, but not try to control. Even if they misinterpret something, I think it should be allowed. After all, politics and technology are misinterpreting so many hundreds and thousands of things. So if a young scholar does a bit of misinterpretation, I don't think it's going to cut into the prestige or significance of a great artist.
I have to tell you a very funny thing that's just like this, and that is we have a music publisher. So we have relationships with a lot of publishing concerns. And our music publisher, somebody called our music publisher and said, well, I just heard a composition played by John Cage by, I won't name the orchestra, by this orchestra, and it was very bad. And I don't think you should ever license work to this orchestra again, because it was so terrible. And our publisher said, well, that isn't exactly how publishing works, number one. And number two, I'm quite sure that somebody is murdering Beethoven right now. You know? So he said, we've come into the big time, that we're being murdered in the world like Beethoven.
Amazing. I think it's time to open it up to audience questions. I see some right there. The mic there, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sonia. I'm a visual artist. I hope to remain alive for the next 2-3 decades. If this air conditioning doesn't kill me today. This is a question in a sort of light vein, but can also be serious. This whole question is about collecting a lot of things. This is a hypothetical question. And this pertains to only that aspect of archiving which is to do with collecting artists' things and stuff. What if the artist herself was a very private person? And what if she did not believe in immortality?
Well, the artist had better describe this before. I mean, there is a point in what you're saying. So we'll say what we have decided in our archive, that very private papers we will keep, and we will only allow access to them if we are convinced that the person who is wanting to have them had kind of noble intentions. How to know that, I don't know. It's just sort of. But once the artist has given over all the material, then you have to take a judicious decision yourself, how you're going to handle such matters. It's a delicate area to handle, and but I mean, there cannot be any hard and fast rules. I am going by the rule that once the artist has given you the material, he's also given access to everybody. That you are holding that material in a sense, not only for the artist, but also for the wider public. Otherwise, like Kafka, you can prescribe to your friend, burn all my manuscripts. Thanks to Max Brod, that we have Kafka as a major presence in the 20th century, because he did not abide by the instructions of Kafka, his friend. So there are, yeah. You want to say?
So it means art must can be eternity or something?
Sorry?
No?
Oh, immortality.
Immortality.
Immorality.
No, immortality.
Immorality. Mortality. Yeah?
Is that a question?
Yeah. But in case of the musician or composer, he or her works is just the information, and so it's quite different from the object make artist, and so I think the composer's score is always a state of possibilities, and even the artist died. And so I have a question to you. I've heard, it's true or not, I've heard the Cage's works of 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and there are 20 scores exist. One scholar said to me.
Is this a question? I'm sorry, I didn't know if you were asking.
20 scores exist, created by the composer, John Cage. Is it true?
No, there are four. Four only.
Oh.
3 by
Okay.
John Cage, 1 by David Tudor, who was the first interpreter.
There are 3 scores. And if the pianist use different score, the performance is different or the same?
Same, exactly.
Same.
It has to do with, I could describe them very quickly. So the original work, for those of you who don't know, 4 minutes, 33 seconds is the title. It's in 3 movements in time, just like any other musical composition, if it's in movements. That total, altogether, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It's scored for any instrument or group of instruments, but it was first performed at the piano by David Tudor. So a lot of people believe that it's a work for piano, but it's not. It can be done by anybody. We've seen it done by MIDI orchestras, singers, solo players on instruments. The first, it is a work in which there's no intentional sound made by the player. So if the person is at the piano, like David Tudor, he closes the piano lid as he begins to not play the movement, and he raises it to indicate the change of movement, okay? So you see a physical gesture, which is the opposite of what you would normally see in performance. The lid would be up, you would play, close when you're finished. This is the opposite. The first score that Cage wrote, manuscript, we would say. Yeah. Score is really, we think of that as the published version, but the manuscript was literally the use of music notation, notes, if you will. Whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, except they were all rests. So if, for those of you who read music, you understand that. So if it's in 4/4 time, you need the equivalent of 4 quarter notes or 4 quarter note rests. It was all these rests. And then he realized how funny that was, that one really didn't need to do that. That really what he was talking about is space and time equivalent. So the second score we call the spatial notation or proportionate notation score. So that is relative to the overall length. You'd say this is 4:33, so this will be 30 seconds, this will be 1.5 minutes, this will be whatever. So 3 movements in space. The third score that he made is the one that's the most popular, and it's published by our publisher, and most people buy this one, is called the Tacit version. So Tacit, with an I, spelled T-A-C-I-T in English language, coming from the Latin, means silence, and it's used in a literary sense. But in music notation, tacit, T-A-C-E-T, you see it in orchestral scores. It literally means you be quiet while other people are making sound. Okay, so, and that's very, very important, because for Cage, there was no such thing as silence. There was just the absence of intentional sound. So the player is being asked to don't make intentional sounds, let all this other sound constitute what's being played, okay? That score that we call the tacit score, literally is one piece of paper with Roman numeral 1, tacit, 2, tacit, 3, tacit. That's it. David Tudor, the pianist, made his own score, which is at the Getty, in the Getty Research Center. And it is his own interpretation. Anyway, it's a very complicated work with a long history.
Yes, yes. Thank you. I think we're...
Just a minute. Yeah. I wanted to, what Sonia ji said, there's a line by Boris Pasternak, which is of course about poets, saying, we are envoys of eternity held hostage by time. So we are envoys of eternity held hostage by time. For the moment, we are held hostage by your presence. Thank you.
There's another question. Is there time? No. Is it okay if... I don't know. Yeah.
So very quickly, is there a would you think that there would be a compulsion at any point to transition into or become a museum? Because you are so close to being a museum to achieve greater visibility. Do you think that that might happen, Ashokji, or with you, because you want to reach a wider audience, you want to disseminate the work more, or with Kusama, for example, as well? You think that's the possibility that the archive might transition into a museum?
I mean, the archive becoming a museum. Well, partly all archives are a kind of a museum anyway, because they are displaying and you can visit them and all that. But to create a museum of the archive, when we do the Raza Museum, most of it will be archive.
Yeah, unfortunately, Kusama's archive is not closed, not open to the public, and the only reservation systems. And in case of the curator or scholar want to the retrospective show or to edit monograph. Only we permitted that by reservation. But it's very difficult to answer this. And normally, archive is for the specialist. And not so many ordinary people want to see it. But sometimes, recently, the people interested in the archives, and sometimes they want to see the background of the museum. For example, the storage or curator's room and the library, and also archives. And so day by day, the people want to have a more precise information about the background of the exhibition and so on, or what is supported the artist motivation or something. So in that case, the archive is generally speaking, it's very fragile, and so it's always very dangerous to lose or something. So in my university and in my museum, want to publish the collected archive material books and for the ordinary people. And we selected the most important information or most interesting point that we edit and to publish it. But archive is, I think generally speaking, it's like a storage room. It's difficult to open to maintain the materials good condition and so on. But I think I understand the people. Many people want to see the background of the creation or background of the curation. So we need to, as possible as we can, to open the information to the ordinary people.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I think we close this panel.